All right, so it seems like we've got people from all over the country and intercontinental, some from Canada. So that's pretty great. The thing that I wanted to talk about today, we're going to be going over the TV pilot for Insecure, which is obviously a TV pilot. We also can talk about movies or screenwriting or all that kind of stuff. Anything that you want to ask questions about, just go ahead and drop the questions into the chat, and then I can go through as we talk about them each way. All right, so this first slide is just me, Greg Tindale. This is my email address. So if anyone has any questions afterwards, you know, I'm always open for an email to chat, see what people have to say about that. All right. So let's kind of get to the next one. Oh, there we go. All right, so who am I? Why did you sign up for this class? Well, first of all, it's free, so that's exciting that everyone gets to come here and do a free class. But so I've been doing improvising since 2006. So I've performed Washington, D.C., New York, LA, Chicago, Sydney, Australia, Austin, Texas, you know, all over the country doing improv comedy improv for a long time. So that's kind of my background for coming at this work, is I've been improvising, making, you know, comedic plays on stage for a long, long time. And then I bring those skill sets into the actual writing that I do. So I've written probably 20 plus TV pilots or episodes of TV or feature films. So I've written a little bit of everything. So I've made a lot of mistakes, and I know a lot of like the wrong ways to get started. So it's always nice to be able to have kind of a breadth of work to be able to take a look at. I was hired to be a staff writer for a TV show called District Land. So that was always fun to be able to find someone else's idea and then be able to write episodes for the characters that they've created as a particular skill set. I've also independently produced my own TV pilot called Permanent Mistakes. So the idea was I wrote the outline for the show, and then I hired improv actors to be the actors. And then we had them improv dialogue the entire script. And then we filmed it all in one night at a tattoo parlor in Washington, D.C. So that's out there, really fun project to do. And then finally, and this is probably the most important for what you're doing here, is that I host a private writers group where I have helped other writers work on over 5,000 pages of scripts in the last 2 years. So I think what my superpower is as a creative is being able to understand what other folks are trying to say and then help them say that in the best way. So are there 5,000 other writers who have written more stuff and made more money and been more successful in Hollywood than me? 100% yes, there are. My real goal is to be able to hear what you're trying to say, understand what that vision is, and then help you frame that to how you want to frame it. Okay. So the first question that we're going to go over here is, are you a planner or are you a pantser? So this is basically the big question of how do you start your scripts? Now, because I'm an improviser, it's very normal for me to just show up on a stage without any idea of what's going to be said and then just start creating something. So that is a completely valid way to do it. So that would be a pantser, but we'll stop first for planner. So I like being able to tell you both of these things because most people aren't one or the other. Most people fit somewhere into the middle. So they do a little bit of planning and then a little bit of pantsing. So that's completely acceptable. It really just depends on how you like to write. So a planner is someone who is a methodical writer from start to finish. Sometimes before they start writing any line of dialogue on the page, a planner knows the exact key plot points to the story. They absolutely know everything that's going to happen. And that can be really fun because as you're doing it, you're working out all the problems before you even get to the page. You know exactly the tone, the feel of everything that you want to do. And then you just show up and you know everything that you have to write. So what we're doing in this workshop is we're essentially saying, here's a lot of skill sets that you can use to become a planner. This is a good way to start for everything. Even if you don't have all the answers, this is a good way to start to have a bunch of the answers of things worth thinking about. So next is pantser. So those are trusting yourself to come up to your writing desk with your ideas, be willing to scrap entire scenes or entire pilots. So this sometimes you're doing a lot more work, but by committing to your creativity, you give yourself room to find the words until you're satisfied. So one of the good examples of a pantser is George R.R. Martin from the Game of Thrones books, is that he just kind of writes characters and he's like, oh, that's weird that this person did this. And he's just like writing and writing and writing without a plan of specifically how each scene's going to happen. People also call them planters because they sometimes will like plant a seed somewhere in a story, and then all of a sudden like they're like, oh, this has turned into this and it's turned into this. So they don't really know where it's going. They just know that they want to keep things moving. All right, so let's see. Wrong way. Okay. So here is the big things, the big four that we're going to be talking about tonight. It's going to be theme, tone, character, and plot. So in my experience, every great script has all four of these things. And in my experience as a writer, oftentimes the first draft of a script that I do only has two of them. And sometimes the ideas that I have will only be really heavily on one, and then I have to figure out the others. So I think we're going to walk our way through and talk about theme, tone, character, and plot, and how to start with that from the beginning, so we're picking projects to write that are really going to be helpful for us. So we're going to be looking at them through the gauge of common things that any writer will use in order to, as part of the development process for their show or movie. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about is the log line. So that is, what is it about? The next is the character descriptions. Who is it about? The synopsis, what is this character's journey? The beat sheet, the outline, which is what is the situation, which will get you to a first draft of the pilot, which will eventually get you to the video recording of the actors actually doing it. So that is kind of the hierarchy of how these things happen from, just an idea to getting it onto the page. All right, any questions here yet? Feel free to chip in on the chat. All right. So the first thing that we're going to go for here is the log line. So a log line is a brief, usually one-sentence summary of a television program, movie, or book that states the central conflict of the story, often providing both a synopsis of the story's plot and an emotional hook to stimulate interest. So if you are kind of in the screenwriting world, maybe you're on Twitter or however you do it, I mean, people talk about log lines all the time, how hard it is to write a log line. That's why I think it can be really important to look at the log line even before you start writing. So why do we need a log line? So it is our North Star for writing. It expresses our show's guiding principles. Eventually, it will be used to get other creatives interested in collaborating. So we're going to talk about how theme and tone play into that in a second, but I want to talk for just a quick moment about low concept versus high concept log lines in shows and pilots. So whenever someone starts a project in one of my writers groups, I always say, okay, what is the goal of this project? What do you want this to be? So a lot of times people are independent filmmakers and they say like, hey, I want to be able to make this. I want to be able to write something and then be able to make it. And if that's your goal, like, awesome. We can think about, what would the budget of the thing you want to make be? Can we write scenes and have situations that are able to be easy to be filmed, kind of knowing the scope of your work. But ultimately, if you are going to make it yourself, it doesn't matter how low or how high the concept is because you are going to be creating it. Now, some people who say like, hey, listen, I live in, middle of nowhere, Kansas. I don't have any connections to the industry. I want to be able to write a script that I can then submit to screenwriting contests or submit to the blacklist, or be able to have query agents and managers to say something to get them to read this awesome script that I've written. So when people say that, I often say, hey, we want to make sure that the log line and the project you're working on is super high concept. High concept scripts, even if they are not as good as a low concept script, will get people to actually read it. And that's really something to consider. Is you might have an amazing story that's like pulls at your heartstrings or is like the funniest thing ever. But if you're trying to get it in front of somebody and it's as simple as like, a family has an argument at Thanksgiving. While that might be the log line for like the most compelling play ever, that would change your life in watching it, that's probably not going to get someone to be like, I have to read this. So if your goal is to write a script where people say, I have to read this, I have to have this idea, I would say, hey, maybe think about having a high concept script be the thing that you're working on, like to really have some kind of hook, some kind of turn that somebody would be like, oh, wow, I need to find out how this plays out. Okay. So, and then there's a million things in between there as far as like what level of high or low concept it is. But if you're going to make it yourself, do whatever you want. If you want someone else to read it, you have a better chance if you're going to have a high concept piece. All right. Going on next. So now we're going to look at Insecure. So the log line for Insecure, and this was from when it first got sold from, and it was on deadline before they made it. The log line was, Insecure follows the awkward experiences and racy tribulations of a modern day African-American woman. So when we get back to this idea of theme and tone, those are the things that should be present in a log line. So theme is what are the grand mysteries of life you are exploring, and tone is what style are you exploring these ideas in, often expressed as X meets Y. So I feel like we get to a point as writers. I mean, sometimes like an idea just sticks in your head and you're like, oh, it would be funny if like, a type of person like this went to space or whatever. You might just have like a silly idea like that where you think, oh, I'd like to write this piece. I think the longer that you write and the longer before you start a project, people start really thinking like, what am I trying to say here? Like, what is this grand mystery of life I'm trying to explore? And something like a sketch in a sketch comedy, like you don't need to worry about what you're exploring. It's just like a 3-minute thing that's funny. And if it explores something, that's great. But when you're putting your effort into writing like an entire TV pilot that would become an entire TV series, or you're writing a whole movie, this idea of like, what are you really trying to talk about is super important. So when we look at this log line for deadline, so the words that they used to get to their theme were tribulations, modern day, and African-American women. So we know that they're going to be studying modern things. They're going to be talking about what the issues are for a particular type of person. So right away, these are thematically the things that we're going to be talking about. So the next, like I mentioned, the tone. So what style are you exploring in those ideas? And often expressed as X meets Y. So in their log line, they had the words awkward and racy. So we know straight away that this log line is going to push the envelope. Like they're making sure that you understand that if you're going to be watching this show, that this is the type of show that you're going to be buying, is going to be different. So, if they wanted to make a different show, they could, just change out a couple of the words and see how it is. So you could say like, follow the absurd experiences and monotonous tribulations of a modern day African-American woman. And all of a sudden, like this is a different show. If it's absurd and it's not based in reality, but it's also monotonous, with the words that we use, those, like I mentioned, those are going to be our North Star to what we're writing for. So it's always helpful to think at the beginning, okay, if I want it to feel a certain way, how do I make sure to get those things in there? All right, so any questions real quick about log lines? Anything people want to chime in with about that? Nope. Okay. All right, so we have theme, we have tone, and now we need to talk about character descriptions. So where do characters come from? How do we find our characters? So we're looking at people in real life. We're looking at people from history. We're looking at archetypes. So I can tell you that for a feature that I just wrote, and I'm getting ready to send out an inquiry with, it started out with, I had just these two experiences that I thought were really funny that led to characters. Like I didn't know the plot, I didn't know what was going on, but it was just something that was really funny. So one of them is I was driving behind a car that was, it had all these bumper stickers on it. And one of the bumper stickers said something like Reiki Energy Master. And the other one said like, you know, yoga for life or something like that. And the third one was it was a rideshare driver. It was, you know, Uber or whatever. And I thought there was something so funny about the ancient wisdom, and like that's one side of your life, but then you're also using like Uber to drive people around. And so I was like, that's a character. Like it was just somebody, I don't know who that person was that was driving it, but then I started to realize, you know, how could we take somebody who really values ancient wisdom stuff, but put them into the world of real life. So I didn't know what the story was going to be. I just knew that that was a character I wanted to explore. And then another one I had friends tell a story about when they were in New York. They were living in New York, and they were getting ready to, they were getting older and they didn't know if they were going to have a baby yet. And when they went to their doctor, the doctor was essentially like, hey, if you're going to do this, you have to do this right now. And it would just reminded me of like a Wolf of Wall Street doctor trying to sell them on having a baby. And I was like, oh, how funny would that be if like the Wolf of Wall Street was like the stork of Wall Street, and instead of a stockbroker, he was a gynecologist. So just like completely random, like there's no storyline there. It's just like, oh, this is a character that I want to explore. So I think that can be a really good way to start off with. And, you know, I took an interesting class earlier last year with Brent Forrester, who wrote for The Office, and he's written for, you know, a million other shows. But he was talking about for him, for comedy, character has to come first. Like if you don't have interesting characters, that the show won't work. And I know that I've fallen into the trap a lot where my main character is the least interesting character because I make them closest to myself. And then they're kind of in a world of other kind of weirder characters. So I would say always try and consider that, make sure that the character is actually really, really interesting from the start versus putting like a normal person into a kind of a crazy situation. So what makes a character compelling once you've found them? You know, I'm not going to go read all of these specific things, but you can kind of look over them yourselves. But it's little tricks that we can have for our characters. You can make them really good at what they do. You can place them in jeopardy. You can make them an underdog, put them in a position to make the right choice, have them suffered undeserved misfortune. So these are kind of like some cheat codes that you can always apply to your character and say like, oh, would it be interesting if their backstory had this? Or how do I get them to be, you know, an interesting character? So here's a lot of different ways to be able to do that. All right, moving on to Insecure. So these are the character descriptions for Insecure that I had pulled offline from when they were writing the script. So I'm not going to read all of these, but one thing that I did want to note in looking at this is you notice that the more important characters from the beginning have more of a description. And that's really what you want, is you want to be able to know who the core people are. The further down the line you go for a TV show, at the beginning, you don't have to have it all planned out. You just have to understand how they are going to be a foil for your main characters. So for this one, it's Issa. When we first meet Issa, she is 29, from a good family, works at a nonprofit, and has been with her boyfriend Lawrence for 5 years. However, despite things being okay, considering how her friends are flourishing and she feels like she is on a steady decline, she decides to shake things up, sometimes in productive ways, and other times in ways that cause unnecessary drama. So, you know, this is really interesting because this is part of the process of we're going to be able to know who these characters are. And I heard one writer say that before they start with the character, they pick out the 6 things that are wrong with them. Is they have to know the 6 things that this character needs to overcome within the story to be able to, you know, reach that level of enlightenment, which is, you know, kind of going back to Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, you know, why we tell stories and why we go on these trips with people. So, you know, for Issa, you know, this idea of being from a good family, working at a nonprofit, and like not reaching her potential. That's kind of her story within this show. And it's really interesting how much of that they had planned at the beginning, and then that's kind of how they write towards it. So another thing that they do really well in this show is revealing character through the script. So when we look at one of the first scenes in the Insecure pilot, which is interesting because the first scene in the classroom with Issa talking to the kids isn't the first scene in the script, but it ended up becoming the first scene in the actual show when they made. That happens when they switch things around to make sure it all works. But this is, again, like a cheat code, is at the very beginning of the show, they have these kids going to Issa and saying, here's everything that's wrong with you. They ask her, why do you talk like a white girl? What's up with your hair? Is this what you always wanted to do? And are you single? So already we know, like within 3 minutes of watching this show, it's going to have to do with black and white race relations. It's going to have to do with the concepts of natural hair, versus more hairstyling. This idea of when you're in a job, which isn't what you want to do, but like that's where you are stuck right now. And then finally, are you single, which becomes, one of the main themes of the show going throughout. And they do a great job in that opening scene as well, where she basically lays out, hey, this is what this show is about, where she says, I'm tired of being told to settle for less. And this pilot is just so good at that, of setting off the entire show, so you know exactly what you're going to be getting throughout the show. It's on you're on your trajectory, you're working towards your North Star with every episode. All right, any questions about character yet? Thoughts, concerns? All right, so next we're going to go to plot. So we've talked about theme, we've talked about tone, we've talked about character. Now we're on number 4, which is the plot. And plot's really interesting for writers, because I feel like I talk to a lot of writers where plot actually comes first. So for example, if you're into writing heist movies, you might think of like, oh my God, like what if a person tried to steal, what if someone tried to steal the Declaration of Independence? Like that was somebody's idea first for National Treasure. And that's a great plot. Like you have one core piece of what you're trying to do. So then going back and being able to say, okay, well then what is the tone of this? How is this supposed to feel? What am I actually trying to say about the people here for the theme? And then who are these people? Like, why do I care about watching them? It depends on, sometimes if you have a really great plot, you have to backfill all those things in. I think a lot of the modern major movies that we get right now, it's plot first, and then they have to back in and add all the little details about it. So just be careful, like where you're coming in from it. So in the chat, going back to character real quick, someone had asked, how do you make your characters feel real or avoid making them feel too static? That's a really great question. We're going to get into a couple other like little bullet points of things to think about as far as the writing of the script and actually the words on the page as we're going. One thing that I can think of is that I always like to think of the characters. This is an improv thing where if you say, if this is true, what else is true? So if you have a character and you're making this description and you're trying to make them this real person in your head, when you put like an obstacle in front of them, or if you put one piece of truth in front of them, like, let's say that, okay, I've got this character in my head and, oh, what if their car won't start? And then you say, okay, if this is true, if I've in my head described this character as a hothead, and then you put this in front of them and say, now the car won't start. So if it's true that they're a hothead and their car won't start, if it's true, then, they're going to have a blow up. So that's part of this idea of having things be real, because oftentimes it doesn't feel real if we're creating characters and then we're giving them obstacles and they're not acting in the way that we have said that they would. If we've created a pattern of like, this person is like this person's like this, then all of a sudden something happens and they don't act that way, I think that's when characters start to feel less real, because you're not showing their actual thought process, their development in the screen for what's going on. It's a great question. All right, so going back to the plot. So like I mentioned, so this is a series-long view of the story you want to tell. And a synopsis also touches on the key elements, events, and moments of the story. And we're looking at a summary of the arcs within the pilot episode and over the whole series. So that's really important to think about with a TV pilot. And this also goes to, you know, what you're planning on doing with the script. There's a story about the guy who wrote the old FX drama, The Shield. And he said that when he wrote it, at the end of it, he just thought like, oh, it would be great if at the end, like, this character dies and it'll shock everybody. And then so he brought it in and he pitched it to FX, and they were like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, what happens next? And he was like, I don't know. Like, you have to hire me to write it. Like, that's the point. So there are some people who you just have, it's just the pilot is the thing. We're creating characters. And then, like, this is the beginning of a story, but I don't know where it goes yet. And, you know, if you have good connections in Hollywood, you can do that and someone will pay you to write the rest of it. I think some people, though, love to be able to understand, like, oh, I want to start a character here and eventually get them to there. You know, you look at a show like Breaking Bad, where you start a character off as, you know, a meek science teacher, but they knew that at the end he was going to become this drug kingpin. Like, they knew that whole arc. And then each season they would be able to have him getting a little bit closer, and then individually, even each episode, they're having him go farther within that arc. So that's always a really interesting way to think about it when you get started. How do you, how are you able to make it begin with the end in mind? So can I create these problems for my character that they might not be able to solve right away, but I know in the long run that they're going to be able to learn and figure that out through the trouble I put them into. All right, so this was a synopsis I pulled from online for Insecure. So Insecure is a half-hour comedy following the friendship of two modern-day Black women, Issa D and Molly, and all of their uncomfortable experiences and racy tribulations. Modern-day Black women are usually portrayed as strong, confident, and flawless, but Issa and Molly are definitely not killing it. These best friends must deal with their own real-life flaws as they attempt to navigate different worlds and cope with an endless series of uncomfortable everyday experience. So then getting into that kind of is the blueprint for what we're doing for the, you know, for who these people are. Then we look at, okay, what is going to happen over the course of this season? So over the course of the season, Issa attempts to figure out what she wants out of life and how to take control of it while fumbling her way through this journey. Molly, a corporate attorney who appears to have everything together professionally, struggles inside as she looks for external ways to fix her life. Meanwhile, Issa's boyfriend, Lawrence, who has fallen victim to complacency, works to get his own act together. And Frida, Issa's overeager white coworker, whose enthusiasm is both annoying and endearing, is at the crux of Issa's racial frustrations at work. So they knew where they wanted to go with this script. They knew what direction that they wanted to take it. They had an idea for what that whole first season was going to look like as they were writing the pilot. And then even here, you know, then they have a little bit more about season 2 and a little bit more about season 3. And you can see as you're going through here that, again, the longer it goes into the future, the shorter the descriptions are, because things definitely change as you're writing. You might realize after you write the full first season, like, oh, we're heading in a completely different direction. But it's always good at the beginning to have an idea of where we're going with this story. All right. Anyone have any questions about plot? Anything in particular or synopsis or anything like that they want to ask? Okay. So right here, we have a little bit of basic outline and story structure. So this is for a TV show, a half-hour TV show. So if it's an hour TV show, it's going to be a little bit different. A movie is going to be totally different. But this is a 7-point story structure. So the first part is the first goal, where the main character discovers something that she wants or is confronted with a problem that they have to resolve. Got a question in here on the the chat for how do you gauge whether or not a plot device is working or not, or watch for plot holes? Great question. So that's something where when we're looking for a plot device, you really have to look at something kind of as a whole. And one of the things that I always tell people is that it's not a real script. Like, you don't really have anything till you've had people read it out loud and tell you what they think. And so I'm a huge proponent of putting stuff up on its feet, finding readers to say things out loud. I was talking with another writer recently who she'd been working on the same script for 3 years, but she hadn't shared it with anyone yet. And I was like, you got to get it out there. Like, you have to have people read this, because you will always miss things in your head that other people will be able to point out right away. And that's really the benefit of being able to have a writer's group, or, having actor friends who can read stuff, because it might make sense to you, but until you have it out there, like, that's the only way to really find it. I was listening to an interview with David Duchovny, from the X-Files and Californication and all that stuff, who's a great writer himself. And he was saying that there's this idea of, I think his father was a critic maybe, or something like that. But there's this idea that, like, what a critic's job is being able to, like, analyze a piece of work, a piece of writing, and be able to see the part of the writing that the writer missed. And that because we're writing it from our experiences, we usually have a blind spot. We usually have this mistake of, like, we think it's about one thing, but it's about another thing. And it really takes being able to have somebody else read it and see it to be able to understand what it's about. And when someone else can put that mirror up to you and be like, hey, I just want to let you know, you thought it was about this, but it's actually about this. And then once you're able to see it through someone else's eyes, you're like, oh, that's why the plot did this, or, like, that's why the character did this. And I've had that with my writing, where I remember I wrote a script like 7 years ago. And then when I went back I was like, hey, whatever happened to that script? And I went and read it. And I was like, oh, I was processing, like, what was happening in my life at that point. Like, I didn't have the like, emotional power yet to, like, understand what was going on in that moment. But then coming back to it, I was like, oh, there's something really great to be said here. There's something really thematically interesting. I just didn't know what it was. So I ended up rewriting half the script, and that's, like, my favorite TV sample right now. So sometimes you do need that help of having someone else to be able to point out the things. I don't think that, and for as much as people say, like, oh, it was written by this one individual, like, every great writer that I know, like, 10% of their script was pitched by someone else to be able to be like, oh, but what if that person did this, or what if that person did that? Or sometimes the biggest things are going to be from other people giving you suggestions. Awesome. Thanks for the question. So going back to the story structure. So oftentimes we have this problem of you have a goal, then there's the obstacle, the problem that gets in their way. They do their first action, which is an unwise decision. So they're actually getting into more trouble. Then you have an act break when the first action they take backfires. Then they go back to a second goal, and then that doesn't work. And then the main character puts the plan B to work, it gets worse. And the resolution is then at the end, the goal is achieved, or the problem is solved with an ironic twist. So this is, like, very, very basic stuff. You will find that a lot of the TV shows you see, like, on network TV, like, they follow this to a T. And it's always good to know this so that you can subvert it. But what I will also say is that I don't know the experience levels of everyone on this call right here. For people who have never written anything, I know how daunting it can be to be like, how do I even start? Like, what happens next? How do I finish? Where do I land? So I want to be able to give you, like, these key plot points to say, like, hey, there is a way to demystify this. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you start writing. This is a way for a first draft to just be like, oh man, like, I'm on page 17. It's time for them to start their second try at solving it a different way, like in a more ridiculous way. So, the more that you write, the more patterns that you can find to be able to get you to the next level. All right. So any questions right there specifically about story structure? So going into Insecure's plot and their act summary. So in the first act of the pilot, Issa is in a rut professionally and romantically. Molly is romantically. The act ends with Issa responding to the text of her old flame, Tindale. So in the second act, we have Issa's job gets worse. Molly's romance gets worse in comparison to her coworker. And then Issa's romantic life gets worse, where at the end of that act, she has a soft breakup with her boyfriend. And then finally, in Act 3, Issa and Molly go to the club. The act ends with Issa rapping and angering Molly. Issa and Molly fight. Issa connects with Tindale, but he pushes her away. And then Issa and Molly make up at the end of the episode. So when you're able to look at it and break it down just like this, it's pretty easy to be able to see like, oh, this is just like a normal way that a story is unfolding. And they didn't have to reinvent the wheel to create this amazing pilot. It just has like a normal amount of heightening as we go through. So looking at that a little bit closer, so they knew that those were the big swipes that they wanted to get to. That was kind of the story arc that they wanted to have for that episode. So then how do we actually write that? If we know we want to start at scene 1 and we need to finish at scene 25, how do we figure out what are all those scenes that we want to be able to do in the middle? So the few things that we're going to talk about for that, the first is perspective. And this is something that I've started to think a lot about as I'm writing my script, and is which characters have storytelling power. So in this show, in the beginning, Issa has storytelling power because she is the one who's actually, it's her perspective. They're following her. We're seeing the world through her eyes. But then Molly also has storytelling power in this episode because we're seeing her in the way that she interacts in the world directly. Now, a lot of people, when they start to write their first pilots, they usually have only one person have perspective. So essentially, the story follows like the same person all the way through. Every scene is seen through this person's eyes, which is completely normal and valid. I think that depending on what you're trying to do, it can be nice to have other people, more than one person, have perspective. But what I'll always say is it's interesting to look at. If you start with one person's perspective, how soon are you going into someone else's perspective? And based on what kind of show you're trying to do, sometimes it can be jarring if it's the first episode and you're 3/4 of the way through, and all of a sudden we start to have someone else's perspective. It can be like, whoa, what happened here? Like, why are we seeing through this person's eyes now? So that is an actual tool in your tool belt of perspective. So always say, consider that as you're writing your piece as well. I don't know how many people are out there watching the HBO Max show Station 11. I just finished it. I won't do any spoilers, but it's kind of similar in Lost, to where it's a big sprawling story and a ton of different characters have perspective, and the whole episodes are just, it's like, oh, you thought this person was telling the story. Now here's a whole nother perspective that you're going to be able to see. So that is a tool that you're able to use. So it's good to be able to understand when you're getting into a project, how many of those people you want to be able to have that. Yeah, someone in the chat writes, not sure why this is called storytelling power instead of to which characters are you giving the perspective. So storytelling power, I'm not sure exactly where I heard that. Maybe it was on like the Script Notes podcast. But so the storytelling power is kind of like who has the potential to push a story further. So usually if it's in your own perspective as the writer, that's the one pushing it forward. It's hard when someone else, when a side character is doing something and it's affecting them, they really don't have the power to push the story further. But if it's in your perspective, you're the one who's being affected by it, so that's why. So for example, this might not be exactly what it is, but there was a movie on Netflix that came out recently called Moxie. And it was a story about high school students. And it was like a kind of, I think it was like in response to the Me Too movement and all that type of stuff. And it was interesting because it was made after Me Too, but before the summer of George Floyd. So it felt like it was like, by the time it came out, it felt like it was progressive on a lot of stuff, but lacking on other stuff. And I was mentioning to someone who said that they really liked it. I was like, yeah, I really liked it too. But I think if they were to do it again, after that summer, they would change some of the perspectives. And she was like, what do you mean? And I was like, oh, at the end, there is a scene where it's all the students kind of standing up for themselves and saying, hey, here's why we're fighting back against the system. But and it did include people of all different backgrounds and races and gender identities and sexuality. So it included all those people, but the perspective was from the white female character. So everyone was doing things, but she was the one who had the perspective on kind of being yes, I agree with you that you deserve to have rights and that type of thing. And so I think if they were to do it again, they probably would have had more characters where we were seeing it through their eyes, so that we as audience would be able to feel oh, here's how a Black woman would feel about the situation. Here's how a transgender person would feel about the situation, not the main character giving her perspective to the other folks. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but so we're okay. It's Ryan saying, so if you're doing a show like Lost with multiple perspectives, would you note that in the log line to prime the reader that the main character in the pilot is not the only main character in the show? Or if not there, how would you indicate that to a reader with no background knowledge of the show? So I don't know that you would do that in the log line. You certainly could. There's the trouble when you have a big show like Lost is that you really can't get everything you're trying to accomplish into a log line. That's usually you need to have the synopsis of explaining hey, here's what I want to do over the course of this. And then depending on how much of it is secret, you have to be able to get those secrets out as you can. All right, let's see. So what I would say that, so when you're doing the actual writing of it, I would say that depending on how soon you're looking at changing the perspective, just to be able to do it sooner or be able to have a set way that you think the show will work. So Lost was really good about, they would be okay, scene number one, we're on the island, something's going wrong. Scene number two, setting up a B story. And then it would be boom, we're going to the flashback. And now we're seeing the story of these people's lives. So that became a pattern where you just know in these episodes that this is how the pattern's going to go. So it can be helpful in a pattern, when you're writing to create a pattern like that, particularly for a show like that, so that it's never kind of shocking. But it also depends on what you want to do, because I know there's other shows. I don't know who watched the Ted Lasso season 2 this year, but there's a whole episode where you're just oh, we're just in Coach Beard's perspective. We're not going to follow anyone else in this episode. It's just him. So the longer that you do a show, you can take bigger swings like that and be able to do different things. But if we're talking about having a TV pilot, I think it really has to be representative of what you want the show to look like. And that's usually putting the perspective in a few little people, a smaller amount of characters' worldviews. Yep, and thank you, Matt, for resharing the link to the Google Drive where this is and a bunch of other sheets for people to check out. Okay, how are we doing on time? All right. So the next thing that I want to say is the rule of threes. So this is an old comedy adage. It's you do something once, it can be funny. You do something again, people are hey, I remember when that happened. And when you do it the third time, you're locking in a pattern and people are hilarious. It's hilarious. Comedy, I've always found, is more about showing something somebody has already seen to them again in a surprising way. So it's about subverting an expectation. And so that's why doing something 3 times is always really effective. And for writing, what we often find in TV shows is we have an A story, a B story, and a C story. And then we are each one of those 3 things we're seeing 3 times. For the improv heads on here, there's an improv format called the Herald that was made famous, by Del Close in Chicago and Second City Improv Olympic, and then more recently with the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater and Amy Poehler and all those guys. And it's really about how do you show someone the same thing 3 times, but you're heightening it each time. And then we as viewers feel good because we've seen the story progress over three things. So we'll talk about that with Insecure in a second. And then finally, this idea of heightening. And there's a great video you can find online with Trey Parker and Matt Stone from South Park, where they're breaking down the difference between and because of that versus and then. So a lot of people, when they write, it's just and then. So you write a scene and you'll be like, oh, that was a nice scene. And then a next scene will happen. It doesn't necessarily have to be tied to the one before that. And that can like tell a story, but a great compelling story really uses and because of that. So what happens in the scene, and because of that, the next scene happens. So it just doesn't go to somewhere else randomly. It doesn't go, oh, this is just another aspect of their life. It's literally every scene you're going into next couldn't have happened without the scene before that. It's building, it's heightening, it's building. So every scene, and because of that, and because of that, and because of that, we get to this new place. Okay, some chatter here. What scenes should you know before writing out a beat sheet? The beginning and end of the A, B, and C stories? Good question. Yeah, so like I said, this goes back again to like, are you a planner or are you a pantser? So a planner would probably know every scene that they want to do, and they'd map it out to get to the ending that they want to get out to. But if you don't know what the ending is yet, sometimes you just write the whole thing and then see if it works. And if it doesn't, you go back and start again. But I think, like I mentioned, with this is 4 things. Like for me, with this idea of theme, it's like, if I don't have an idea of what I want you to feel like when you leave this show, when you leave this episode with this movie, it's like, why are you even writing it? Like it can be as funny as hell, which is great. And then you're just saying like, at the end, I want you to feel like you laughed, which is like a completely reasonable and noble job to make someone laugh. But if you can also make them laugh, but then at the end be like, whoa, like I had never considered this that way, or like, oh, that's an interesting take on that subject. So that's what I think is the best way to plan and helps you find that North Star is, you know, how you want to make people feel by the end of what they're reading and watching. And Matt's saying he's watching Squid Game right now. I haven't seen it yet, but the way they show heightens from scene to scene is awesome. So yeah, I know that's, that's the most popular show in the world right now. So that's not surprising that they're doing some heightening. And then I like to plug this into, because some people often ask like, well, how many pages is like the script supposed to be? What's supposed to look like? So this came from someone else's writing class, and they said that they really like it when you have the teaser of your script and the first act is between 9 and 11 pages. Act 2 is like the bulk of it, 12 to 15 pages. And then Act 3 is 8 pages or less. So, and that really makes sense when we're thinking about the type of stories we want to tell. So this first act, we're introducing the people and just getting them into some kind of trouble. We don't really know who they are, what they're about yet. But then in that second act, we're figuring out, okay, how do these people handle adversity? How do these people trying to fix the thing that they have as their obstacle? And then once you set all that stuff up, then Act 3 should just be rolling downhill. Like you shouldn't have to think about what should happen in Act 3, because it should become clear that if I have put this character in this situation and this character acts this way in this type of situation, then that is true. So what else is true about what they would do next? And the characters essentially start making the decisions for you versus you having to kind of subvert the expectations for people. Question in the chat, would you say all formats from shorts to features to pilots should all have 3 acts? I wouldn't say that necessarily, but what I will say is that pretty much every great story has a beginning, middle, and end. That's kind of a hard thing to argue against if you want to have people have a resolution. And this doesn't get into like, if you want to make like an art film, like that's totally like a reasonable thing. Like if you just want to give someone an emotion, there's not necessarily like a big payoff. Like that's a completely acceptable form of art. I watched that movie Werewolves Within this year. I don't know if people saw that one. I think that's what it was called, but with Sam Richardson and it was a good movie. It was like kind of like a plot heavy kind of movie, but there was just one scene in it where it was Sam Richardson, and I'm not going to be able to remember the woman's name. She played Squirrel Girl in the Marvel pilot that never went, and she's like on the Verizon commercials, I think, AT&T maybe.
Miliana Weintraub.
Yes, that's her. And there's one scene of the two of them in this kind of like rec room with like neon lighting, and they're like flirting with each other. And it didn't have like a beginning, middle, and end. It was just like the emotions of that thing. I was like, oh God, I could watch 90 minutes of this, just like the energy of this scene. So it depends on what your goal is. Like, that doesn't have to have a beginning, a middle, and end to be a great little piece of art. But if you're trying to go through one of these traditional mediums of storytelling of, movies or TV, usually, yeah, you want to have a beginning, middle, and end. Yeah, in the chat, we're saying 1 hour TV series generally have 5 or 6 acts, and Lifetime movies have 9 act structure. Yep, that's totally true. And and what's interesting too, when you look at like the TV 1 hour TV, I mean, essentially they have that many acts because that's when they can get the most commercials in. So it's not a storytelling thing necessarily, but it has to do with, oh, we've figured out that if we tell this kind of story, we can fit this many commercials in and make more money doing it. So part of it is art, part of it is commerce, when you get into that realm. All right, so that's talking about beat sheets. So when we're looking at the Insecure pilot episode, so for perspective, both Issa and Molly both have storytelling power, so they can both push the storytelling further onto each other. And that might be a good way to answer the question from beforehand, because if a character has things going on for them, but they're not able to affect the main characters, then they don't have storytelling power. But if Molly can do something and it affects Issa, then she has storytelling power within it. So the rule of threes, there's some really interesting ones. So for example, in the A story, Issa's romantic tribulations, and the B story, Molly's romantic tribulations, and then C is Issa's work story. So it's really clear, like there's 3 different stories that you can tell in little chunks going throughout. And there's really great heightening in this pilot too. So we go from the beginning with Molly's looking at her friend at work who says that they have a good boyfriend, and then she's jealous, and then by the end of the pilot, that person is engaged. And so it heightens for Molly that she thought it was bad when they were just having a good relationship, and it's even worse now that they're engaged and she is not. And then at the beginning for Issa saying she's not going to dump Lawrence, to the middle, she's doing a soft dump where she actually goes through with it, to the end where she's actively looking for another guy. Really interesting heightening. And then at the beginning, we have her rapping in the mirror only for herself. And then we end with her rapping at the club. So it's heightened that idea from the beginning all the way to the end. All right. So I also like to include here, and we're not going to go over each one of these things. This was a beat sheet, again, that I pulled online, that goes into every scene that happens within this show. And it's interesting to note that there's 25 scenes. So when you think about your TV pilot, about like, oh, what scenes do I have to write? Which scenes do I know are important? A lot of people will do the old, note card thing where you write the scene heading down on a note card and you put it on the floor and see how many you have and like what stories you want to tell through that. And so essentially when you're getting started, it's like, okay, I have this idea, I don't know what to do. You just pencil in 25, like pretty much 25 scenes is how many scenes you have to be able to push the story forward. And I haven't broken it down directly here, but I bet that, if you look at which of the 3 storylines we're doing between Issa's relationship, Molly's relationship, and Issa at work, it's probably, out of 20, it's probably like 10, 10, and 5 or something like that. So they're able to tell each of the important stories at a regular pace. So this idea of, oh, how do I tell the story? Which scenes do I have to know before I go into it? It can be daunting, but also it's only 25. So just like pick 25 scenes. And if they work, they work. And if they don't, you can be like, oh, I thought I wanted to tell this scene, but I actually don't. And you just cut, paste that to a different document and you tell that for a different story. All right. So any questions about beat sheets or what that we have to say about that? Any thoughts about that? All right. So we kind of buzzed through all that. So this is kind of some closing remarks before we can have any more questions or anything people want to talk about what they're working on or thoughts that they have. But I always like to include this this quote from Ira Glass from NPR, and with this idea of, well, what do you do if you don't feel like your work is good enough yet? And he said, nobody tells us to people who are beginners. I wish someone told me. All of us who do creative work, we get into it because we have good taste, but there is this gap. For the first couple of years you make stuff, it's not that good. It's trying to be good. It has potential, but it's not. But your taste, the thing that got you into the game, is still killer. And your taste is why your work disappoints you. A lot of people never get past this phase. They quit. Most people I know who do interesting creative work went through years of this. We know our work doesn't have the special thing that we want it to have. We all go through this. And if you are just starting out, you are still in this phase, you got to know it's normal. And the most important thing you can do is a lot of work. Put yourself on a deadline so that every week you will finish one story. It is only by going through a volume of work that you close that gap and your work will be as good as your ambitions. And I took longer to figure out how to do this than anyone I've ever met. It's going to take a while. It's normal to take a while. You just got to fight your way through it. Yes, great quote. And going back to some of the writers groups that I lead, where someone will come in with an idea and they'll, like, the first draft will be like, wow, like, this is a great idea. Like, you don't know how to do this yet. Like, you have to try, but like, you're not a good enough writer to be able to do what you want to do yet. And then, sometimes, after a couple months of writing and working on it, they'll bring it back in and it's just way better. And you're just like, that to me is like the most proud I am of working with people, when it's like, they have the talent, it's there, they're figuring it out. And then it all kind of comes together and they're able to build off of what they're doing, which is really lovely. And they also like this Ray Bradbury quote. So he says, write 1,000 words a day, and in 3 years you will be a writer. So it can take 1 million words for free before someone will pay you to be a writer. So a couple interesting quotes right there. All right. So that was the presentation I had for you. Do any folks have any specific questions or things they want to talk about, either on camera or off camera? So that's going to be it. So again, anybody has any questions, happy to email me. I'll send out this recording to everybody who was on here and then have more information about the writing group moving forward. Thank you, everybody.